Welcome back in my virtual class of self-taught science. I hope that this time you didn't got bored for too long. Sorry for the abrupt end in my previous lesson, but I spent 10 days of quarantine, funny story by the way, recording my batched up English while editing the movie, only to realize that I didn't even start discussing all the good stuff I wanted to show you. So I just rendered the edited part just as it was. Before I proceed with the currently discussed subject, let me once again state that science of any kind is for me nothing more than a weird kind of hobby. I can't and I won't tell anybody what kind of medical procedure, if any, she should or shouldn't get. My personal opinion about the presented matter doesn't matter at all, and you can all show it yourselves anywhere you might want to. Imagine my surprise when my last movie, just like the previous one, didn't result in a permanent ban of my YouTube channel and a total excommunication of my Google account. I'm really thankful to YouTube platform for the possibility to speak about controversial scientific data without being censored and or limited in any way of expression, as it would make me really sad. Sadly, it wasn't even an irony. We live in times when British Medical Journal is being removed from Facebook or Meta if someone actually calling it this way, as apparently the articles published there couldn't get a positive fact-check verification. And now it seems that the oldest medical journal ever can be officially deemed as a bunch of misleading anti-vax conspiracy theories and or Russian disinformation campaign. Not exactly the best time to make a movie in which the universal laws of indisputable safetyness and unquestionable effectiveness of the four major officially approved COVID-19 vaccines produced by Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson is being discussed or even questioned. What I'm doing here is like playing soccer on a minefield while being blindfolded, and it seems that I play solo against a team of decisive referees in this match. And yet for some reason I seem to be winning 2-0. I can think of two possible explanations of how it could happen. A. My public outreach is too small to get under the radar of the Ministry of Proper and Approved Narration, or simply to make them care in any way. B. Data which I presented turned out to be too problematic to be labeled as false by experts from fact-checking agencies. But whatever might be here the cause, I'm really glad with the final outcome. However, due to me being me, I still can't hold myself from talking about scientifically verified data that might be too problematic for people from the Truth Ministry to be outright dismissed and asking difficult questions that shouldn't be asked in public, like safe to who or effective in doing what? Well, we all probably can agree that COVID-19 vaccines are perfectly safe for the good being of their producers when it comes to taking any responsibility for anything that might happen to someone who decides to take the lucky shot in the open worldwide free-to-play gene-altering lottery called the vaccination program. When it comes to the general safety to health of vaccinated person, well, here couple things require some further discussion. I, for example, would ask for one, what does it actually mean for something to be safe for a healthy person? For me, being safe means something what doesn't affect the risk factor in the process of being alive and in good health in the next couple years following the discussed procedure. Drinking a glass of water is something what meets all standards of general safetyness in like 99.99998% of cases. Believe it or not, but there is always a tiny chance of drowning in glass of water. So now the question is how the general safetyness of drinking a glass of water compares to genetic manipulation which forces healthy cells to create toxins that have the potential to cause serious harm or death. Well, it doesn't look so nice anymore. And if you ask what exactly might happen to you due to administration of a generally approved anti-COVID-19 vaccine, well, shortly put, much more bad things than drowning while drinking water. I'm sure that up until now, most of you managed to notice the cool looking animation in the background. And if so, you probably notice as well that it's a very nice visualization of the general mechanism utilized in the approved mRNA based COVID-19 vaccines. Of course, like always, I vulgarly stolen it from a CDC founded YouTube channel called Nucleus Medical Media. But of course, I did it for a specific reason. Obviously, due to me not having any actual credentials when it comes to the ongoing program of global immunization, I can't pretend to have the final voice of absolute authority and God-given power of making the final and definitive judgments regarding things being scientifically true or not, but I can still point out those things which seem to be inconsistent with scientifically established state of affairs. I really appreciate all the efforts that were put into making this cool looking animation, which saves me a ton of explanations, but calling the spike protein a harmless part of the virus is for me something like calling jaws or claws safe body parts of dangerous animals. And before anyone will call my statement as scientifically baseless, I suggest checking some of the links in description and or even better, watch two previous movies uploaded to my channel. In shortcut, the most important mechanism that determines the cytotoxic nature of SARS-CoV-2 spike protein is determined by its ability of causing apoptosis and autophagy of healthy and uninfected host cells just by binding to ACE2 enzyme and disrupting its natural regulatory function. All of this was already established in the late 2020, and since that time no one didn't even dare to try arguing with the general premise and the experimentally verified data backing it up. So at the time when this stunning visualization of mRNA technology was uploaded to YouTube in the middle of 2021, cytotoxicity of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein was already an established knowledge among people with proper credentials, or at least it should be. Considering all those circumstances, it's for me hard to believe that at the time when this movie was being made, scientists leading this project didn't hear anything about the findings proving the spike protein being most dangerous and toxic among all the structural proteins of the SARS-CoV-2 we know of. That doesn't even need the virus to cause serious injuries of the vital organs, induce cell death, autophagy, and autoimmune disorders associated with prolonged state of constant cytokine storms, and those are only the primary features of this particular viral protein. The list goes on and on. I just don't have the determination to spend 10 minutes of this movie speaking about the same things for the third time. No, I will do much better thing. Let me now use a common technique of thought control used often by the mainstream media to encode a specific worldview in the viewer's mind. Since we all know already that the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein is toxic to human body, then let us all now see how much toxic it actually is to a living being. As any other toxin, SARS-CoV-2 spike protein should be able to cause a measurable amount of damage to a healthy person, which may vary depending on amount of the toxic substance and on the way of introduction. Also, at a specific concentration or amount per 1 kilogram of body weight, the damage being done will always lead to a certain death of any individual. This amount is a toxin lethal dose. Of course, there are many different types of toxins. Probably the most infamous ones are the poisons based on cyanide. Here is the chemistry of toxic substances that defines the damage-inducing mechanism. In case of spike protein, damage to the tissue is based on mechanism that is far more biological in its nature. Because of these differences, comparing both toxins to each other might be somewhat troublesome. Still, just like cyanides, SARS-CoV-2 spike protein should have a more or less defined quantity of a lethal dose. If this quantity would be known, we would be able to compare it with the sodium cyanide and assess its potency of reducing the sheep population. Problem is that a little dose of cyanide poisoning doesn't take long to come to its fruition. All you need is a proper dose to change a status of patient to deceased in less than 2 minutes, but I have absolutely no idea if the same can be applied to the spike protein, as its cytotoxic nature requires probably some time to reach 100% of effectiveness. But of course, I might be also completely wrong, and at a certain level or concentration, spikes will eat up your brain from within in a couple minutes. There isn't enough official data for me to tell you what will happen to someone due to an intravenous injection of spike protein at amount equal to 1 milligram per kilogram on body weight. But fear not, as I might be able to show you the data on a specific concentration of spike protein that will most likely lead to a serious injury of lung tissue during the next 72 hours. This value is equal to 400 micrograms per kilogram of spike protein introduced intratracheally to a mutated mouse with induced expression of ACE2. Although such spike-based therapy didn't kill any test subject for the next 3 days, a clear evidence of tissue damage was observed. So what? Since 400 micrograms equals to 0.4 milligrams, is the spike protein just as potent as sodium cyanide in sheep number reduction? Not really. There are at least two crucial factors which you still need to include before trying to reach any conclusion. A. It's not a lethal dose of spike protein. B. Compared to intravenous injection, intratracheal introduction requires higher dosage to be equally lethal, in general. What it means, or at least supposed to, is that 400 micrograms per kilogram of spike protein that is injected intravenously will most likely lead to much more serious destruction of the body than the same amount of spikes inserted intratracheally, as the protective tissue in the upper and lower airways stops partially the spike protein from getting into the soft tissue of lungs and into the bloodstream. Sadly, I couldn't find any data regarding the potency of ship number reduction for different quantities of spike protein being introduced to the ship by intravenous injection. But let's say that due to some unknown circumstances, I'm being forced to choose between an intravenous injection of SARS-CoV-2 spike protein at the quantity used in this experiment, 400 micrograms per kilogram, or take an equal dose of hydrogen cyanide. Which option would I then choose? Hmm, let's just say that for now I need a bit more time to properly assess the risk-benefit factor of this rather risky choice. Little dose of hydrogen cyanide is around 1 mg per kilogram, and the dose which is proposed to me instead of spike protein equals to 0.4 mg per kilogram. Well, for now it seems that cyanide looks like the better choice. I know, I probably shouldn't say it. Of course, a rationally thinking human being would expect that people working in health agencies did couple basic studies regarding the toxicity of a substance before injecting it into 80% of human population. Yeah, well, obviously rational thinking is for losers. Stop being one and respect the authority of agency. If your agency tells you that something is safe for you, it obviously is perfectly safe. Spike protein can be in any way toxic since agencies clearly state it is harmless. What other evidence do you need? Take the first dose for free and get a second one extra. Luckily, we don't need to remain solely on the mercy of health agencies or multinational big pharma corporations to acquire some additional data regarding the toxicity of SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. Although, as I said, there is no information about the absolute lethal dose of this substance, there are some studies of tissue damage that is induced by a specific dose of concentration of this harmless piece of virus. In this particular study, cells that were treated and exposed to 0.1 micrograms of the spike protein for 24 hours experienced some, probably severe damage. So here we have a definitive quantity of the substance in question that is capable to injure and or kill healthy cells. Not that much. Here, on the other hand, we have a specific concentration of the harmless piece of virus at which it clearly expresses its potency in neurotoxicity. Apparently, the barrier function of endothelial cells was disrupted after 12 hours of exposure to the spike protein at a concentration of 10 micrograms per milliliter. And here is a study in which 50 nanomoles of the harmless spike protein induced a pathological damage to the mitochondrial function in brain tissue after 13 minutes of exposure. Sadly, I'm too stupid to recalculate it into dosage given in units grams per kilograms. If someone is smarter than me and is able to do it properly, please let me know in the comments. And lastly, here is a study that might shed some light on the potency of SARS-CoV-2 spike protein to reduce the number of sheep by assessing the toxicity for the spikiest part of the spike. Here, three peptides, PSPD 2001, PSPD 2002, and PSPD 2003 were identified as the most toxic fragments of the entire spike protein. And just how toxic are they? Well, in an experiment that was supposed to simulate an aquatic contamination with the spike protein, two groups of tadpoles were exposed to the three most deadly spikes peptides at two concentrations, 100 nanograms per milliliter and 500 nanograms per milliliter. Of course, as we read, both concentrations were high enough to induce significant injuries on tadpoles, with peptides PSPD 2002 and PSPD 2003 causing couple more pathological responses compared to PSPD 2001. What probably matters here at most is the fact that in the difference to the whole spike structural protein that induces damage due to biological processes like apoptosis, autophagy, or autoimmune response of the host body, Those peptides are causing damage to cells due to molecular chemical reactions, similarly to cyanides. This information allows me to give a possible answer to at least one of my questions, the one about the possibility of spike protein having a dose at which 100% of sheep will get to a better side of the earthly plane in matter of couple minutes since exposure. My uneducated guess is that the way in which the spike protein interacts with cells depends on its level of concentration, with biological mechanics dominating at lower levels of concentration and with the chemical reactions taking place when a certain concentration of the protein is being reached. Besides that, I can also use this data to make a direct comparison between the concentrations of spike protein and the cyanides that are toxic to aquatic animals. In this experiment, 100 nanograms in milliliter of spike protein was enough to cause biological damage to tadpoles. And here for comparison is a paper which discusses the toxicity of cyanides in aquatic environment. Now all we have to do is to convert the units of concentration and compare the numbers. 100 nanograms per milliliter is 0.1 milligram per liter. 500 nanograms per milliliter equals to 0.5 milligrams per liter. And it seems that the concentration of peptides that were used in the experiment corresponds nicely with the range of concentrations at which cyanide is toxic to most of aquatic and non-aquatic life forms, that is between 0.1 mg per liter and 0.5 mg per liter. Here's another paper which shows the concentrations of cyanide that make a little dose for different species of aquatic animals. As you can see, here the range is much wider compared to the previous source. However, in the end, it seems that the general toxicity of the three spiky peptides seems to be somewhat similar to the toxicity of cyanides. Having all this in mind, it's rather hard to consider the spike protein as a harmless piece of the virus. To be somewhat harmless, the spike protein shouldn't be capable of binding to ACE2, what is responsible for biological damage, and it shouldn't include peptides PSPD 2001, PSPD 2002, and PSPD 2003, responsible for chemical and molecular damage of cells. Of course, now the most important question is if any producer of the approved anti-COVID-19 vaccines did anything to satisfy those two safety conditions. Of course, we know already that all the additions of spike protein utilized by the approved anti-COVID-19 vaccines are fully capable of binding to ACE2 and initiating a chain of biological processes involving apoptosis of cells and the autoimmune response, including the S2P prefusion stabilized edition of the spike, which is utilized in both mRNA-based vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. To the left you have a source which proves it. And so, condition required to guarantee the biological safety of the spike protein as it is utilized in approved anti-COVID-19 jabs doesn't seem to be met by any of them. That leaves us only with the question regarding chemical safety of the spike protein. Sadly, I couldn't find any source that would confirm if peptides PSPD 2001, PSPD 2002, and PSPD 2003 are or are not written in the genetic code utilized by the approved anti-COVID-19 vaccines to teach human cells how to produce the harmless spike protein. I'm sure that someone with proper education should be able to decode all the peptides in the spike proteins from vaccines using some specialized software, but it's way beyond my limited capabilities. For now, it seems, however, that until those concerns won't be addressed by someone with proper credentials, we'll have to wander in the dark by ourselves. In such case, maybe we should try learning more about the toxicity of spike protein by urinating into fish tanks and observing the survival rate of fish for the urine of people from different test groups, naive, vaxxed and infected. Sadly, I'm not sure anymore if it's just a joke. And to finish discussing all the advantages of spike protein in being as surprisingly effective as a harvester of sheep, I would like to show you this interesting study that might give some answers regarding the general safetyness of an intravenous injection of mRNA-based anti-COVID-19 vaccine and become a nice transition to another chapter where I will discuss the clinical manifestations of all those mechanics that I've tried to explain up until now. Here, for example, the cytotoxic nature of intravenously injected spike protein leads to a life-threatening condition, inflammation of heart muscle, called myocarditis, and or inflammation of the pericardium, known as pericarditis. In this particular experiment, one group of mice got a dose of Pfizer BNT 162b2 mRNA vaccine equal to 0.25 micrograms per gram or 250 micrograms per kilogram via intravenous injection (IV), while second group got the same dose intramuscularly (IM). Third control group of mice got a normal saline intravenously. And now I have to warn those of you who are somehow sensitive to images of dissected dead rodents exposing shamelessly their own entrails, because this is exactly what you're about to see in 3, 2, 1. Yummy. Yeah, as you can see, mouse in the middle, intravenous injection of mRNA vaccine, had its heart covered by grayish tissue that can't be seen in mice from the other groups. Images on the heart on top were taken 1 day after the injection, and the grayish tissue only starts being visible on the heart muscle. Mice on the images below were ceremonially sacrificed 1 day later, and here the damaged tissue is visibly wider and thicker. This grayish mass is nothing else than a scar on the heart muscle, a scar that can't be healed. Heart, just like most of our vital organs, can't regenerate itself. Specialized cells of the heart muscle that die due to apoptosis and autoimmune response are being replaced with a scar-like tissue, which won't never reach the efficacy of original cells of the heart muscle. I'm sure that you still remember the study in which a dose of spike protein equal to 400 micrograms per kilogram was introduced to mice intratracheally and caused injuries of the lungs. Believe me that I would be more than happy to compare it with the dose of 250 micrograms per kilogram injected intravenously. Sadly, it won't be so easy due to one important difference. Here, it's not complete spike proteins that are being injected into vein of a mouse, but the genetic code of those spikes written into chains of mRNA enclosed within lipid nanocapsules. And only after those capsules will manage to compromise cells in the body of a vaccinated person and deliver instructions to the ribosomes, spike proteins will start being produced by those cells. What makes this difference so important are some of the extra features utilized in Pfizer COVID-19 vaccines, thanks to which mRNA is being translated into the spike protein more efficiently compared to the natural replication of SARS-CoV-2 and its spikes. So each lipid nanocapsule can make more of the spike protein faster than the virus. And now the question is, how much more and how much faster? But of course, there is no scientific data to answer those questions. What it means in practice is that 250 micrograms per kilogram of mRNA containing lipid nanocapsules doesn't necessarily have to be translated into an equal quantity of created spike protein. In theory, quantity of produced spikes might greatly exceed the number of lipid nanocapsules in the vaccine. Strangely, scientists working in Pfizer didn't publish any information regarding the quantities of spike proteins that are being created by compromised cells due to vaccination. Your guess is here as good as mine. But what actually matters in the end is that in both studies administered doses were lower than the lethal dose of hydrogen cyanide, 1 mg per kilogram, and yet they were high enough to cause a serious damage to vital organs. But before making any conclusions regarding the heart inflammation being a possible side effect of mRNA anti-COVID-19 vaccines, let's see what we can learn about this subject on some of the fact-checking sites. This particular article was published at dearpandemic.org on 28th of May 2021, and at this time there was much less studies and reliable scientific data compared to the huge number of sources available for us today, March 2022. And apparently the date of publication is in the case the only honest argument that might explain the amount of this info which is stuffed in just one short paragraph. I won't lie by saying that the amount and concentration of this information in this particular article got me overwhelmed to the point where I don't know anymore where to begin addressing all of the false and misleading information. In the end, I decided to start from the bottom line and point out obviously false claim about COVID-19 vaccines decreasing the transmission rate of SARS-CoV-2 and limiting the number of COVID-19 cases among people who are vaccinated. Thing is that according to some quite prominent YouTube creators, making such claim in a movie will most likely result in a permanent ban on YouTube platform for spreading medical and scientific disinfo. So to make things perfectly clear, according to most of health agencies, just as the main producers currently available COVID-19 vaccines are supposed to reduce hospitalization and death rates among those who were infected. Vaccinated people still can get infected by the virus and spread the disease to others at a similar rate as those who are unvaccinated. If the vaccines would be really effective in preventing infection and transmission of SARS-CoV-2, the entire pandemic would be already over in all nations with high level of vaccinations. But as we all know, this is not the case. And to give my fact check an additional dose of credibility, here is a recent study published in January 2022, which shows quite clearly that there is no meaningful difference between the viral load and transmission rate for vaccinated and unvaccinated people after they get infected. Okay, since I've already begun fact checking this article from its bottom line, I think that I might as well continue doing it backwards. Let's then look closer at the fragment which speaks about vaccine induced heart inflammation. Although it isn't in any way highlighted in the market fragment, we can easily distinguish two different claims regarding this potentially life-threatening condition being one of many possible adverse reactions to mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. In his second claim, author of the fact-checking article states that a direct relation of causality between any kind of COVID-19 vaccine and myopericarditis hasn't been officially established by any self-respecting health agency. So, it might be nothing more than an unrelated coincidence that there is a higher than normal number of people who end up in hospitals with heart inflammation, and it only just so happens that it keeps happening in couple days following the injection of a mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccine. Nothing to see here. Remember, it's safe and effective, and for free. Honestly, I was just about to speak about a possibility that at the time at which the fact-checking article was published, May 28, 2021, there wasn't still enough data to establish a direct relation between mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccines and the occurrence of myocarditis and pericarditis in recently vaccinated people. But after making a quick research, I've had to change my mind, as according to CDC, this relation was already established in April 2021. This leaves us with two possible ways to explain why the fact checker, a certified PhD, stated something which is obviously completely false. 1. Author of the fact checking article didn't follow the news about adverse reaction to COVID-19 vaccines and or didn't check the updates of the safety guidelines which are being regularly published all over the internet by multiple health agencies all over the world. 2. Author was actually well informed about the mRNA vaccines might be causing heart inflammation as a possible side effect, but decided to intentionally lie to the public by telling that a direct causality wasn't established at that time. But the truth is that no matter what might be the reason, what we get as the result is a prime example of a true medical disinformation that might actually cost someone's health or life. Imagine that someone reads this article and makes a decision to vaccinate him, herself, or his or her children, and not knowing that there is actual possibility of developing heart inflammation as a side effect of the jab. And then imagine the shock if it actually would happen. One can argue that such a person might then be trying to sue out of hell the fact-checking Mrs. PhD for spreading misleading medical information. Google should be ashamed of itself for having this article listed on the first page of a search result. So let me once again clear it out. We are long past the time when the question was if there is any connection between COVID-19 vaccines and the elevated risk of having potentially life-threatening conditions. This connection was already established a couple months ago. Now, the only question that still remains unanswered is how are the vaccines causing those life-threatening conditions? And there is quite a lot of scientists and physicians putting a lot of efforts in order to answer those and other questions. Having this part cleared out, let's move further back to the previous statement in which the author admits knowing about two different reports of myopericarditis being experienced by a number of people just a couple days after taking mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccines, and that according to both reports, vaccine-induced heart inflammation is actually pretty mild. I think that it's especially important to address the part about the vaccine-induced myopericarditis being a mild adverse reaction, which is in most of the cases mostly transitory and wears off after being properly treated in a hospital for a couple days. What makes it so important is that such statement appears in 99% of approved sources where this issue is being discussed. I guess that in this particular case, we should first clarify how we understand the idea of a mild health condition. If by a mild case we think about a situation where the patient does survive and the clinical symptoms of his/her condition are subsiding after getting a proper treatment, then yes, vaccine-induced myocarditis can be described as being mild in most of observed cases. However, if by a mild condition we think of a case where the patient is fully recovered after a couple days of treatment and where the condition doesn't have a serious long-term impact on the general state of health, then well, a vaccine-induced myocarditis isn't actually that much of a mild case. Of course, I am not a cardiologist to give a proper professional expertise in every diagnosed case of heart inflammation, but even so, I can still point out a couple well-known facts about the biology of human body. First of all, we need to keep in mind that except the liver, most of vital organs in a human body do not regenerate, and that inflammation induced by the spike protein initiates apoptosis, a literal die-off of healthy cells. As we saw already in the mouse model, cells that make the heart muscle don't grow back in the same form after they die. Instead, they are being replaced with cells of a scar-like tissue, which doesn't have the elasticity and firmness of an actual muscle. What it means is that such injury of the heart muscle will lead to a permanent decrease of its efficiency. On the images to the left, you can see a series of MRI scans that reveal pathological changes visible in hearts of people with a diagnosed vaccine-induced myocarditis. Although the scarrings don't seem to be as extensive as in the mouse model, still all of those people will most likely experience serious problems for the rest of their lives that might lead to a cardiac arrest and death in next couple years. The sad truth is that for someone with such scar on the heart muscle induced by autoimmune response, the only way of a complete recovery is a heart transplantation. And now the most important question is, how many people from those who experience a vaccine-induced myocarditis developed those irreversible changes? Sadly, at this moment I don't know the answer. Another statement that you will most likely see on most of official sites that speak about the safety of COVID-19 vaccines and the risk of heart inflammation which they pose is that myopericarditis is more common after COVID-19 than after vaccination, and so you should vaccinate your kids immediately. But as always, I don't intend to take someone's words as granted, and I have the opportunity to confront the official information given by multiple health agencies with the real life data and see if there is any reason to trust in anything what's being said by the health officials. And so, here is the official data regarding the number of multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, recorded in the US up until January 31, 2022. As you can see, since the initial outbreak of SARS-CoV-2, there was 6,851 cases of MISC, from which 59 patients died due to this condition, what gives a mortality rate equal to 0.86%, so not that much actually. Now keep in mind that MISC can affect any vital organ, and it's unknown to me what percentage of those cases involve the inflammation of heart, probably less than 100%. But let's for now assume that heart inflammation happened in each of those cases. And here is the VAERS data regarding the number of heart inflammation induced by COVID-19 vaccines, recorded in the US since the beginning of vaccination program in the beginning of 2021. Sadly, there is no information about the age of patients and about the outcome of their condition, so I can't compare the numbers of children who died due to myopericarditis after COVID-19 and after vaccination. I tried to search the VAERS database manually, but it turned out to be too difficult to me, as the numbers completely didn't match the value that is visible below. But if we keep in mind that the vaccine-induced myopericarditis has the highest rate of occurrence for people younger than 30 years old, then we can more or less compare those 5,002 cases with the 6,851 cases of post-COVID-19 MISC. And if we do that, then it will indeed turn out that there could be more cases of heart inflammation due to COVID-19 than due to vaccination. But the outbreak of COVID-19 began 1 year before the vaccine became available to public. So if both numbers will continue to grow at their current rates, then around the summer of 2022, vaccine-induced myocarditis will take the lead over MISC in the number of cases. And here is another piece of data that might tell us something about the occurrence of myopericarditis. Those are the numbers of adverse reaction to COVID-19 vaccines that were recorded in Canada. I've marked with arrows the adverse reactions of special interest. I've marked as well chest discomfort and chest pain, as besides the myopericarditis, those symptoms might be a sign of a couple different serious cardiovascular conditions, like the pulmonary hypertension, PAH, which I spoke about in my first lesson of virology. Here are the exact numbers of reported adverse reactions, Of course, I wouldn't dare to claim that those numbers represent the actual number of Canadians who experienced all those reactions. According to some, there is a massive underreporting of those incidences, while others say that it's impossible to know for sure if each of those cases was directly caused by vaccination. So instead trying to figure out what might be the real number, I will compare the rate of occurrence for myopericarditis with other kinds of adverse reactions. So it will be possible to assess how frequent is the heart inflammation comparing to other side effects that are being experienced by vaccinated people. And what we can learn from such comparison doesn't go too well with the claims about the rarity of vaccine-induced myopericarditis. If those numbers can indeed tell us something about the rates of occurrence for different adverse reactions to COVID-19 vaccines, then it seems that the chance of experiencing heart inflammation is higher than the chance of having such side effects as rash, vomiting, swollen lymph nodes, diarrhea, muscle pain, or cough, among many others, all of which are generally considered as being quite common reactions. And once again, I don't say that this is how things look like in real life, I just show you data that might suggest it. Okay, but let's leave for now the subject of myopericarditis and move to the point where I finish recording my previous movie. That means to my own fact checking of the fact checkers trying to discredit the credibility of Mr. Byram Bridle and to disprove his claims about the toxicity of spike protein and its ability to cause a serious harm to the vital organs of a vaccinated person. Yes, this is where I finish editing the previous movie, and from where I initially wanted to begin today's lesson. But as you can see, it didn't go too well. Apparently, I found one instance where the claims of Mr. Brittle are being addressed and fact-checked personally by an actual expert, or someone who speaks like one. And imagine that, some of his statements seem to be right on spot, like the one which I've marked. Mr. Expert is in this case 100% right. As for today, it's impossible to give any kind of evidence-based answer to any of those questions. But shouldn't the vaccine producer provide us with such crucial data? Didn't they do any experiments with their own products? And if for some reason they actually didn't, why aren't there some independent studies regarding the toxicity of spike proteins? Sadly, it seems that while Mr. Expert specializes in questioning claims which stand against the established narrative, scientific verification isn't obviously his field of interest. Of course, I'm not in a position to speak here in the name of Mr. Brittle, but I think I can answer Mr. Expert's question about the data regarding neurological disorders due to anti-COVID vaccines. My advice to him is to try making something what some people would call as basic research. It really isn't that hard. I suggest to begin from making a simple Google search for those two terms, neurological plus vaccine. There is even no need of adding the word COVID. I can guarantee that there will be more than enough of data to fully satisfy Mr. Expert. Of course, I don't expect you as a viewer to be an expert in the field of medical science, so the best if I will just show you a couple examples of data which I got by doing the basic research by myself. I won't get here into details of every study and article that I'm about to show. If you want to read their headlines, simply pause the movie. Okay, you should probably get the gist of it by now. It has to be an extraordinary combination of overblown ego and total ignorance for someone to consider himself an expert when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines while having no idea about any neurological disorders that are being observed as side effects of the vaccination. In shortcut, according to multiple generally approved sources, the most frequent neurological side effects of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines are headache, Guillain-Barré syndrome, venous sinus thrombosis, and transverse myelitis. Some of the less frequent neurological disorders that are being caused by those vaccines can be seen in this table. I'm sure that some of you will now say something like, there is no drug which is completely safe. Every vaccine has some risk of causing a serious side effect. What matters is that the risk of having a neurological adverse reaction due to anti-COVID vaccine is obviously lower than the risk of having similar disorders due to having COVID. And my answer is maybe. As for now, I can't give you any data proving otherwise. Thing is that it was never the point in this discussion. What I argued with was the supposed lack of actual data proving that anti-COVID vaccines can and do cause many serious neurological disorders, and I think that I already proved my point well enough. There is a ton of hard scientific data to say without any reasonable doubt that neurological side effects do happen due to anti-COVID vaccination. Sadly, I can't tell you what's the true rate of occurrence for any adverse reaction, as it is impossible to tell if the cases are over or underreported, what is the actual factor for the recorded numbers, and in how many cases there is no real causality between vaccination and the recorded condition. What I can do, however, is to show you how the number of nervous system disorders recorded in the European Union compares more or less to the numbers of other known and observed adverse reactions to anti-COVID vaccines. What you can see here is data provided by the EUDRA Vigilance, European equivalent of the US Vaccine Adverse Reporting System, VAERS. What is being represented on this graph is the total number of adverse reactions sorted by their categories and seriousness, with pink color for serious and orange for non-serious events. Sadly, the numbers are separate for each of the four major brands of currently available anti-COVID vaccines, and it's not possible to combine all of them on a single graph. This particular graph shows the number of adverse reactions to the Pfizer vaccine. As you've probably already noticed, those two blue arrows mark the category of nervous system disorders. It is a category with the second highest number of cases just after general disorders and administration site conditions, with 112k serious cases. Here is the data for adverse events for Moderna anti-COVID vaccine. And again, nervous system disorders have the second largest number of cases with around 42k serious cases. Here are the numbers for the vaccine produced by Johnson & Johnson. Again, nervous system disorders have the second highest number of cases with around 6.5k serious adverse events. And finally, the AstraZeneca vaccine. And just like in previous cases, nervous system disorders have the second highest rate of occurrence. It's also worth to notice that the number of cases in this category is higher than for other anti-COVID vaccines, with 118k serious events, compared to Pfizer, where for 736,000 of recorded cases in all categories, 112,000 of cases involve the nervous system. Here, for 444,000 of all recorded adverse reaction, it's 118,000 cases of nervous system disorders. If those numbers reflect in some way the actual rates of occurrence for different categories of adverse reactions, then AstraZeneca seems to affect the nervous system much stronger than other vaccines. Okay, but what about the second part of Mr. Expert's question? I guess that he's asking about the results of clinical studies that were published by Pfizer to allow themselves get the emergency authorization of their COVID-19 vaccine. If so, then. First of all, it's probably not the best idea to put an unconditional trust in the evaluation of a product if it's being evaluated by the provider of that product. It's like trusting a car dealer when he speaks about the technical condition of a car he wants to sell you and make you overpay for it. Personally, I rather wouldn't put my life on stake and take the word of a dealer when he tells, "Trust me, it's perfectly safe." Second of all, Pfizer isn't exactly known as being law-abiding, transparent, or honest with the rest of the world, considering that among giant pharmaceutical corporations is the one which spent the largest amounts of money on multiple settlements and fines. Its financial and medical activity should be probably very closely monitored by independent organization. It becomes even more crucial if there are clear signals about some serious violations of safety protocols and multiple breaches in data integrity, as this is exactly what happened in the case of anti-COVID vaccine clinical trials. Lastly, third of all, it's not too smart to rely on data which makes you to scratch your head if you try to make some sense of it. You see, I went through the published results of those clinical trials some time ago, and even on the first side, I was able to see that there is something wrong with this paper. As you might guess, I went straight to the data regarding observed adverse events, and right away I've noticed that some of those numbers simply don't make any sense. So if I read the entire chapter to ensure myself that I didn't misunderstood or misinterpreted the presented results, and apparently I didn't. I can understand that during the trials there were 2 people more who died in the placebo group compared to those who were vaccinated, 4 to 2, if any of those deaths wasn't directly connected with the vaccine trial. Sure, shit might happen to anyone. Someone could fall off the stairs, some other could be run over by a road roller or get struck by lightning. Many things could happen in such a large group of people during those 2 months. But please, can someone explain to me how on earth injections of saline placebo can lead to a higher number of serious and life-threatening adverse reactions compared to the group injected with the actual pathogen? And it wouldn't be such a big problem if we would be talking here about 5 or even 10 people in both groups. Then it could be purely accidental. But we're talking here about 39 life-threatening adverse reactions to saline placebo and more than 120 of severe ones. How it might be even possible? Can someone be allergic to saline? What is the mechanism of severe adverse reaction to a sterilized solution of salt in water? Did someone stick the needle in the arm of injected person so deep that he managed to reach the heart? Did someone forget to add water to the salt? Or maybe someone took the wrong bag and instead of saline, 100 people was injected with a liquid solution of pure crystal meth? Besides that, the list of observed adverse reactions is limited only to ones that are mild by default: fever, fatigue, headache, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle pain, and joint pain. What about chest pain, shortness of breath, dizziness, fainting? Didn't such reactions happen, or did they happen but were ignored since they weren't included in the predefined list? Considering all of this entire publication is completely useless. It can't even work as a toilet paper, although it might gain a tiny bit of value if we soften it with water before using it in a proper manner. And yet, most of health agencies and their representative officials refer to it as to a holy Bible when assessing the risk factors and efficiency of medical treatment, and bringing up the numbers presented in it every time when the safetyness and efficacy of vaccines is being discussed. Luckily to all except the experts from all those fact-checking articles, there is no need to limit ourselves to a single study with questionable reliability while assessing the possible dangers of anti-COVID vaccines. I might be weird, but somehow I put much more trust in studies that weren't founded by the big pharma corporations and which were conducted by scientists and physicians that aren't working as chairmen in multinational health organizations. Here, for example, is a study from Saudi Arabia, which might give us a somewhat better perspective on the rate of occurrence and severity of adverse reaction to the Pfizer mRNA COVID-19 vaccine among kids 12 to 18 years old. As we can learn here, for a group of 965 children, 571 of them, 60%, experienced some kind of side effect of the vaccination. Among those 571 kids experiencing adverse reaction to the vaccines, 369, 65%, had to take some kind of medication to mitigate the side effects, what makes 38% of the entire test group of 965 kids. 81 of them had to visit a physician, what makes 8% of the whole vaccinated group and 14% of all experienced side effects. And finally, 49 kids required hospitalization because of the jab, making 5% of the entire test group and 8% of all adverse events. It's possible that I have a different view on the general safetyness of a drug than the health agencies, but I would say that hospitalization rate of 5% is actually quite a lot. For 20 vaccinated kids, one gets hospitalized. And for the end, let's look at the most often reported adverse reactions. As you can see on the table, in this particular study, chest pain and shortness of breath were actually observed as one of the couple most common side effects of Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, even if for some unknown reason they weren't included on the list of adverse reaction in the results of clinical trials published by the vaccine producer. I wonder if it's not because those reactions might suggest some pretty serious health problems, like myopericarditis or pulmonary hypertension, among many others. Of course, it's impossible to tell how many kids with chest pain and shortness of breath develop those conditions. Let's then look at the occurrence rates of those two particular reactions to the Pfizer mRNA vaccine. There is, however, one problem which I have to deal with. I'm talking about the number of cases being separate for both doses of the vaccine. 55 cases recorded after the first dose and 62 cases after the second one. The issue is that there is no way of telling if some of those kids didn't experience the same symptoms twice after each dose. Sadly, I have no other option than to ignore all of this and treat those numbers as individual cases. This will allow me to add both numbers together and calculate the rate of occurrence for the entire test group instead of groups reporting adverse reactions after each dose of the vaccine. Now the math should be quite simple. 55 plus 62 equals to 117 cases of both chest pain and shortness of breath for the entire test group of 965 children after both doses of Pfizer mRNA vaccine. This gives us the occurrence rate equal to 12% for all of the 965 vaccinated kids and 20% of all reported adverse reactions. But I gotta admit that I loved all the efforts that authors of this publication put into making those results somewhat less alarming. First, they say that only 8% of adverse reactions requires hospitalization, and then they try to blame the worrisome parents for high number of hospitalized kids. Strange, but I don't remember anyone being hospitalized due to any of the vaccines that we are getting at this age. I don't know. Maybe children were healthier 20-25 years ago, or maybe back then vaccines weren't based on deadly toxins. I'm sure that the government approved fact checkers will now say something like, but if those vaccines would be really as dangerous as you claim them to be, wouldn't there be plenty of vaccine injured people in the countries with the highest rates of vaccination? There is no way that we wouldn't hear about it. Yes, I'm glad that you asked me about it. You're absolutely correct. There is no way to silence thousands of people, maybe even tens or hundreds of thousands, suffering serious injuries because of COVID-19 vaccines. Sure, it's possible to suppress the flow of information for some time, but in the age of internet and cell phones, there is no way to keep a secret at such a large scale longer than for a couple months. In case of Israel, it took almost a whole year before we started to hear about the massive numbers of vaccine injuries. According to the results of a study which were recently published by the Israeli Ministry of Health, around 66% of adults who received a booster shot in 3 to 4 weeks prior to the survey experienced some sort of side effects, and almost half of them, so around one third of all recipients, had difficulties to perform their daily activities because of it. Apparently, one of the most common adverse reactions involves some pretty serious menstrual disorders. But of course, we know that COVID-19 jabs are safe, so it can't have any impact on the fertility of Israeli women. Statistically, there is only plus minus 2.6 days of difference in the menstrual cycle, so it's all okay. It means only that there is a desired immune response and the vaccine works as it's supposed to. But okay, even if those vaccines aren't exactly so perfectly safe as we are being told, and the adverse reactions aren't exactly so extremely rare as they're supposed to be according to health officials, but then those jabs obviously have to be surprisingly efficient in doing what they're supposed to do. That is protecting vaccinated people against hospitalization and death due to COVID-19, right? Yeah, about that. Some people probably hate the idea of real and unaltered data being available to the public because of scams like me, who can use it to fact check their claims. And it just so happens that I have here the right source of data that should tell us everything what we need to know about the glorious efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our world in data. I think that most of you can read, and I won't need to explain what is being shown on the graph to the right. If so, let us now see how things are going in Israel comparing to other countries. And well, it seems that for some reason a successful national program of COVID-19 vaccination didn't change that much when it comes to the rates of hospitalization and death due to that illness. Of course, everybody knows that all currently available COVID-19 vaccines are pretty useless against the Omicron variant. So it's completely pointless for me to speak about that massive spike at the end of graph representing the new cases of COVID. It is, however, worth to note that Omicron is supposed to be much less severe, especially for vaccinated people. And yet, during the surge of Omicron cases at the fourth wave of COVID-19, death rate was the same as during the second wave of Delta variant 1 year earlier. Also, the number of patients in ICU was only slightly lower than for the second wave, while being visibly higher than first and third waves. Interesting, but let's look at some other countries from the list. Here is Denmark, a country with an excellent rate of vaccination against COVID-19, with around 2.3 vaccine doses per single citizen. And here things get even more interesting. During the huge wave of Omicron cases, There was indeed much less patients in ICU than for the previous two waves of COVID-19. In Denmark, there were only three waves. Yet death rate exceeded all previous waves, and right now it still keeps growing. Now, that's quite funny, don't you think? But let's keep going. Here we have South Korea, a shining example of a completely successful national program of vaccination, with almost 2.5 doses for each citizen. And here we can at last fully admire the legendary efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines. I don't know if I won't get banned on YouTube for verbal description of a publicly available official data, but here it's clear as a day that the rates of death and hospitalizations were growing together with the rate of vaccinations. Right now, after almost half of the population got a booster shot, death rate was boosted as well. And just like in Denmark, it still keeps breaking all previous records. And lastly, my favorite one, Australia, a country where people in power decided to battle the pandemic in the old school way, that is by locking all unvaccinated people in camps. I mean, recreational concentration parks. It's for their own good, I guess. But I think that those graphs don't show the picture as nicely as those from the worldometer site. Don't you agree that here the spike of daily deaths looks much more ominously? Now we can fully admire how effective are the policies based on segregation of citizens addicted by the government in a system that can be described as a medical regime. Looking at those graphs, one must to ask himself if battling COVID-19 in Australia didn't go exactly as it was planned by the ruling class, or maybe if everything isn't rather going according to their plan. Well, I would say that it depends if the plan actually was about fighting the pandemic, or if it was always about reducing the number of sheep in the earthly flock. And why one might get such irrational doubts? Well, it appears that COVID-19 vaccines are surprisingly effective as the harvesters of sheep, but their efficacy in preventing deaths and hospitalization due to COVID-19 is deep below zero and in the range of negative values. Not only they don't help preventing deaths and hospitalizations, but they are obviously making things much worse. Those words are probably the worst kind of blasphemy on the YouTube platform, but this is exactly what the data shows. You can't argue with the numbers. And now let's compare all of this with the situation in a country where the rate of COVID-19 vaccination is well below the level which might be somewhat acceptable by the health official. Like in my own country, Poland, with less than 1.5 doses of vaccines for a single citizen. To the right, you can compare the vaccination rate in Poland to countries with higher vaccination rates and the world. I'm sure that Fauci and his crew are scaring small children with horror stories about piles of dead unvaccinated people rotting on the streets of Polish cities. Let's then see how bad is actually the situation in here. And apparently, since the beginning of pandemic, death rate of COVID-19 in Poland was surprisingly high compared to most of other European countries. But somewhere in the middle of January 2022, things quite drastically changed for the better due to the miracle of Omicron variant taking the domination over all other variants of SARS-CoV-2. Apparently in Poland, Omicron had exactly those kind of effects which everyone expected it to have since the initial reports came out of South Africa. It caused a significant increase in the number of daily cases while clearly decreasing the daily number of deaths due to COVID-19. I'm sure that political elites of the EU will have to severely punish the stupid and stubborn Polish people for not doing as they were told and thus ruining a big part of their great plan of the Great Reset and the birth of the new world order of global socialism. Okay, I guess that is long past the time at which I supposed to end today's lesson. Sorry, but it seems that once again I got carried away too far and completely lost the track of time flow. But before we finish, I want to show you just 3 additional graphs with some quite interesting data regarding the safety and efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines in younger age groups. I think that the presenter's face speaks here for itself, as obviously he doesn't look too happy about the data which he's presenting to his public. I also wouldn't be happy to admit that just around the time when COVID-19 vaccines were approved to minors and adolescents, hospitalization rates in those age groups started growing higher than ever before. And my mood would probably get even worse if after that I would have to keep convincing parents about the benefits of getting their children vaccinated. Luckily for him, people who treat CNN as their primary source of information aren't exactly known for the ability to think independently from the approved mainstream narrative. You see, there seem to be two kinds of people: those who make their own opinions by themselves, and those who need to be told what opinions should be their own. When the health officials stated that vaccination greatly reduces the risk of hospitalization and death of children due to COVID-19, people from the second group took their words as granted and vaccinated their kids without a single question, while people from the first group checked out the statistics of death and hospitalization due to COVID-19 and found out some questions that need to be asked, like why the number of hospitalizations started to grow in younger age groups right after COVID-19 vaccines were approved for kids, before they allowed someone to stick a needle in arms of their children. Of course, there's also a third, rather small group of people who from the very beginning of outbreak in Wuhan knew that it's just yet another attempt of the global elites to reduce and enslave the human flock and to create a new world order where they will be owning every possible aspect of the remaining ship's life, while the ship won't own nothing and they will be happy. People from this group keep tracking multiple statistics from day one of the pandemic, and after seeing how strongly the health officials are pushing the vaccination of children, they immediately started monitoring the rates of excess mortality among younger age groups. And if you belong to this small group of people and you indeed are tracking the statistics of mortality among children, then your reaction to the graph on top is probably something like, of course, they said the jabs are effective and the harvest time already started. What else did you expect? Be prepared that the party will get only better from now on. And the party indeed appears to be warming up, as it seems that soon many from the group of people capable of critical independent thinking will be joining the third group as more and more critical information becomes available to the general public, making a loud and clear wake-up call for those who can still think by themselves. Of course, at the same time, people from the second large group will pretend that absolutely nothing is going on, and confidential documents like the one released recently by Pfizer, which describes 1,291 different side effects of their vaccine, don't exist at all, waiting patiently for someone with authority to tell them what should be their opinion about all of this. Sadly, I don't think they will live long enough to see it. And this is where I will end today's prolonged lesson. As a goodbye, I will relatively slowly scroll through that list of 1291 side effects. So if you didn't see it already, now you have the chance. Class temporarily dismissed. Roll the credits.